Well, to answer some of those questions and maybe give us a pointer to the direction we are heading in with Ukraine, I'm delighted to say that back with us is Jamil Jaffer, who's Executive Director of the National Security Institute at the George Mason University in Washington, D.C., and I think one of the most sensible voices on this issue that I've ever heard. Jamil, good to have you back.
Actually, thanks for having me.
Oh, gosh, it's such a pleasure. You heard me there asking those basic questions. I mean, it does look like that Zelensky is now seeing proper fatigue from those countries that have been supporting him. Where do we go from here?
Well, this has been the challenge of this conflict from the beginning. You're exactly right that we expected this war to be over much more quickly. We thought, frankly, that the Ukrainians would lose, and they have demonstrated a staying power and mettle that we did not expect. We didn't expect the Russians to be so impoverished in their capabilities and their morale. At the same time, the Russians have also stayed their ground and have not given back as much ground as we once might have hoped a year on into the war. And so part of the challenge, though, for me, Petri, really is, what's our plan? What's the Biden administration's plan? What's the Sunak administration's plan to win this war? If we're going to be in it for the Ukrainians, we've got to want them to win. And if that's what we want, then we should give them the capabilities they need, all of them, now. Frankly, we should have done it 2 years ago, and give them a fighting chance to win. Unfortunately, what we've done instead is we've sort of eked our way in, sent little bits and drips and drabs. In fact, the UK has been the most aggressive in leaning forward and sending the tanks and saying they're going to send F-16s. And so, it's not clear that even though we're on the Ukrainian side that we want them to decisively win. I think we're afraid of what the Russians might do if they start to really lose on the battlefield. And that's no way to win a war. And so it's no surprise that we're in this quagmire. We have created it by not really saying we want the Ukrainians to win and then giving them everything it takes to win.
The issue always seems to be with the West. At any point when I read a lot of books on war and war strategies, that's how sad I am. But it always seems that there is no exit strategy. We don't ever plan for an exit. If you just look at Vietnam and the disaster that was that, look at what, even Iraq, Afghanistan, that we're gung-ho going in, but it doesn't seem that anybody sits there and goes, right, one day we're going to have to leave. One day we're going to have to withdraw. How do we do that without creating more damage than we have done by going in?
And we haven't done it effectively since World War II, and World War II, in part, I think the reason why is in World War II, the United States, the UK, the Allies, we committed all of our resources to winning that battle. And it was life or death. We either won or we didn't. And we put everything into it. And when the war was over and we'd won, we said, now we're going to put everything into rebuilding and to reestablishing democracy and freedom and creating open societies. We've never been willing to make that kind of victory commitment in the time since World War II, nor have we been willing to make the commitment in the aftermath to really rebuild and restructure. And so, Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, now Ukraine, it requires real commitment and real leadership. And, truth be told, Petri, there's been a lack of real leadership in the West for a long, long time. And we can put that at the feet of the United States and our presidents, 3 or 4 in a row. Or we can put it at the feet of the European allies, right? Regardless of whose feet you put it at, the truth is we have not yet been willing to do what it takes, commit to the fight, and then commit to the aftermath and succeeding in the aftermath.
I mean, again, if we look at World War I and World War II and how we extricated ourselves from those. I mean, the end of World War I was a disaster because we insisted that the Germans signed the Treaty of Versailles, which embarrassed them, it impoverished them, they had to pay enormous reparations, they didn't have enough food. I mean, and that gave rise to Hitler. That was a gift to Hitler, and he rose. And then at the end of the Second World War, we practically let all those Nazis off the crimes that they committed. Very few of them went to jail, and very few of them were in jail for very much longer than 6 months to a year. They were all released. So we don't, what are we going to do to Russia? That's the question that, if Russia loses, we can't go down the path of another Treaty of Versailles, because that will create another monster. And we can't just let everybody off like we did after the Second World War, because that leaves people feeling that this can just happen again and again and again. Does anybody sit down and figure this stuff out?
Well, I think a lot of this goes back to the fact that we don't actually extract costs out of anybody. We've gotten out of the mode of actually, punishing people for what they do. And so, the Russians came, they invaded a sovereign country. They did it wantonly. You have the rise of political parties on both sides of the aisle that are making excuses for the Russians and saying, well, there's this Russian-speaking territories in Ukraine and they weren't being treated well. I mean, that's a bunch of nonsense. This is a sovereign country. Russia acted illegally, and they should have paid a price early on. Instead of doing that, we sort of slow walked aid in, see how the Ukrainians do. Now they're doing better. Let's give them a little more, but never enough to really win, and never really enough to punch the Russians in the teeth and to hit them at home where it hurt. So, it's no surprise that, they're not going to bear the cost of this. And I think you're exactly right. Even if the Ukrainians push them out, it'll just be to earlier borders. They probably won't push them out of Crimea. And the Russians, that was part of the beginning of this, was why did we let them take Crimea back in 2015? And let that go untouched. Yeah. It created this monster.
Yeah. And that's fear of, the elephant in the room is we're afraid that he'll press the nuclear button. The man is 70 years old. He's got nothing, if he loses Russia, he's got nothing to live for. And he's the kind of narcissist, like Hitler was, if I'm going, you're going down with me. So that's the elephant in the room. That's the West's fear. But instead of talking about that and being honest about that to the rest of us who get it, right? We're scared of that too. There's this sort of prevarication. There's this sort of nobody's talking about anything. So none of us know where we are. All we know is that there are billions and billions and billions of dollars flowing towards Ukraine, but we don't know really what for.
Right, and what the plan is? Is the goal to have the Ukrainians win? And if the goal is to have the Ukrainians win, we have to say we are not afraid of that, meaning that Vladimir Putin might think about it. We have to tell him, look, that is unacceptable. Yeah. And if you do it, you're gonna get wiped out. Yeah. But we're not willing to do that. We're not willing to put our toughest foot forward. This is the entire problem with the Western alliance. We don't have the courage of our convictions. We like to talk a big game, like to talk about freedom and democracy, like to talk about how we're supporting Ukraine.
But we're not fanatical about it in the same way that Putin is fanatical about Russia.
Yeah, and he knows that, and our adversaries see that. Yeah. They saw what we did in Afghanistan, the way we left that country, the way we abandoned our allies. They see that we're not really we let what happened in Crimea happen. They see that China's been allowed to build those islands in the South China Sea and gone unchallenged. They see the U.S. and the U.K. getting hit by cyber attacks day in and day out, and we don't really hit that, right? We always tell our kids, Petri, hey, listen, if a bully bothers you on the playground, don't confront them. Go to the teacher, talk to the teacher. We'll handle it behind closed doors. That's terrible advice for your kid, to be honest with you. The right advice for your kid is punch that kid right in the face in front of everybody, and nobody will bother you ever again.
Yeah, stand up to your bully.
Yeah. And that's even more true in international politics.
When we look though at let's say the American relationship with Ukraine, we know that Biden has said recently that he's prepared to still keep funding Ukraine, $75 billion. There must be the people of America must be going, hang on a minute, we are in a financial crisis here. We can't afford to put food on the table, and you're giving £75 billion away to some country we don't even know where it is. Not denigrating all Americans, but I suspect that is true of many. And that's okay while Biden's there. But what happens if Trump does win? He will withdraw the money, surely.
He will. And the problem here is that the case has not been made to the American people. The American people are willing to have America, and they want America to lead in the world. They want America to spend the money and if necessary, put our troops in harm's way. But you have to explain to them why. Yeah. You have to tell them what it is you're doing, why are you doing it, and what's the plan. And the problem is We haven't been willing to put our troops on the line. We're not willing to explain to the American people. We want to spend a bunch of cash, but not have an end game. And then we're going to eat that cash in slowly and eat those weapons in slowly because God forbid, Vladimir Putin might threaten us with the nuclear button. If he was going to launch nuclear weapons, he would have done it by now. The real truth is we got to call his bluff and say, you know what? You want to play that game? We have nuclear weapons too. Nobody wants that. Let's be realistic. Let's fight this battle the way we're going to fight it, and let's see who can win this.
I mean, that's why it's called mutually assured destruction, right? That was the whole point. Mad. It is mad, but it is mutually assured destruction. But I think a man that is apparently unwell and old perhaps doesn't really care about mutual destruction. He's more concerned about his own destruction. We've been waiting in the West as well, Jamil, for somebody in Russia to take Putin out. Everybody has been, so that'll be our get out of jail free card. That'll sort it out. We won't have to do anything then. It'll all be sorted. But first of all, that hasn't happened. And second of all, we don't know who's going to replace him.
Yes.
And there are some really truly, Putin's not a nice man, but there's some really truly evil people in Russia, men, who could replace him.
That's right. That's exactly right. I think that the idea that we're going to get something better off if we just got rid of Vladimir Putin, I think is almost exactly wrong. The more likely scenario is we get somebody worse, right? And there are folks around him, not necessarily the oligarchs, but some of the folks in the security services, the FSB and the like, who would do Putin, one better, and get more aggressive. And so I'm not sure that the sort of, I'm not a fan of Vladimir Putin. I don't want him to stay in power in Russia. But I'm not sure that the let's take him out and that'll be success for us is a realistic scenario. The real success has got to come on the battlefield, and that means really getting behind the Ukrainians once and for all. And if it takes more money, okay, but let's talk about what that number is.
Yeah.
Let's talk about what those weapons are. Let's give it all to them. Let's let them win, and then let the chips fall where they may. Right. The problem is we've never really been willing to go down that road, and it's no surprise that here we are 2 years in. And we're still eking it out.
And getting rid of all our old stock. And suddenly now NATO's saying we've run out of that old stock. And so we need to start actually producing weapons for Ukraine, which feels counterintuitive. Jamil, should we go as far as boots on the ground?
Look, I've been a believer since the beginning of this war that Putin was going to come after civilians, and he has. Tens of thousands of civilians killed. He's intentionally targeted schools, hospitals, apartment buildings. I think we could have avoided a lot of this had we imposed an air cover over Ukraine and kept Russian bombers away. We chose not to do that because we didn't want to put U.S. or allied troops on the field. Okay. And we see where we are. The Ukrainians have done a great job fighting back and pushing back. But we have seen a significant number of casualties, civilian casualties. And that is an unfortunate outcome, and we will continue to see more. That number will only grow if we let this war continue the slow burn that is taking place. Which is why I think if we're not going to put troops on the ground, and I recognize that none of the Western nations are there, that we've got to double down and give the Ukrainians everything they need to win. We just haven't been willing to do that. So we play this middle game of we'll give them some stuff, and they'll fight to a draw. And that's great for everybody because Vladimir Putin's not launching nuclear weapons. Ukrainians aren't winning too aggressively, and more civilians die. And by the way, more destruction in Ukraine that we are going to have to pay to rebuild.
Yeah, exactly. The reparation bill, the repair bill. Just very quickly, though, we are not in a position, though. We've got ourselves painted into a huge corner where we can't leave them to it now, can we?
No, I think that if we abandon the Ukrainians now, nobody will trust us, and I say us collectively, the allies, as an ally or as a fierce foe, right? Nobody really today fears the U.S. or the UK as a tough foe. Nobody trusts us as an ally. Look at what we did to our allies in Afghanistan. We now abandon the Ukrainians. Just another thing on that list. And that's what other nations, you remember, Petri, during the Cold War, there's a discussion of Finlandization. Finland would move towards the USSR or the US, depending on who was stronger. We will see other nations Finlandize towards the Chinese and or the Russians and that larger coalition they're building with the Iranians and North Koreans. That is not a place you want anybody to go. And yet, if we are not a fierce foe and a strong ally, that's what will happen.
Well, that's what we saw with fascist Italy, wasn't it? As well, they were hedging their bets. Jamil, it's always a delight to chat with you. I could do it. I wish we could sit down with a whiskey and a bottle between us and do it sometime. It would be fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. Jamil Jaffer, the Executive Director at the National Security Institute at George Mason University in Washington.